Is HEMA broken? Should we all be training wrestling? This is a response to English martial arts. Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Scholar Gladiatoris. So, English martial arts channel, my friend Oz, who I've known for 20 plus years, more than 20 years, I don't even know, long time, recently put up a video saying HEMA is broken, but here's how to fix it. And I recommend you go and watch that video, link below. Okay, so having watched that video, I assume you've now seen that, or if for some reason you can't, in a nutshell, Oz's argument is that everybody doing HEMA should train wrestling to fix HEMA. So, first of all, I partially agree with some of the points that Oz made, and I also disagree with some of the points that Oz made. So let's look at my perspective. So to answer the basic question, is HEMA broken? No, HEMA's doing very well. It's way more popular than lots of other martial arts styles. There's a lot more HEMA clubs out there, for example, than Kenjutsu clubs. So literally, if you want to do HEMA in London, it is easier to do it now than Kenjutsu or Iaido, or I believe even Kendo. If you want to do HEMA in Surrey, where I live, it's actually easier to find a HEMA club now than to find a modern sport fencing club. So HEMA itself is doing really well, and the levels of expertise and ability that is exhibited both at club level but also at competition level, and we have a very vibrant competition scene now. For example, in the UK we've got the Wessex League, one of the, I think probably the biggest league, certainly that I'm aware of anyway in Europe, and so with lots and lots of tournaments, people competing very regularly. And essentially it's quite akin to the sport fencing scene in terms of how much people are training for it and how often people are competing now. So HEMA has come on huge leaps and bounds in the last 20 years, but it's even come on leaps and bounds in the last 5 years. I myself stopped competing in 2016, I think was the last time I competed, and since then the HEMA competition scene has evolved hugely. So HEMA is very fast moving and developing. And with full respect to Oz, he hasn't necessarily been involved in HEMA very much in the last few years, and I think he might be surprised at some of the developments that have actually happened if you went to something like a Wessex League event in terms of the judging, the rules, the streamlining of all of it, and the competition level as well. It's all just gone up a lot. So HEMA's not broken, HEMA's doing very well. Now the next point to address is, do I think everyone would benefit from doing some wrestling? Yes, I actually agree with Oz here. I actually have never in a structured sense studied any wrestling. I've done individual wrestling classes, I've done quite a lot of grappling, particularly with knives and daggers. So I guess you could say to some extent I've done some grappling, but usually there's been a weapon involved, and I've been doing that for 20, 25 years. I've also done bits of pugilism with various people in the past, and I used to do Kung Fu, so I have done other unarmed martial arts, but it's never been something I specialised in. As you guys know watching this channel, and as Oz knows, I have always specialised in weapons. However, the basic argument is, could wrestling, let's say you gained an extra 2 hours or 3 hours or 4 hours in your week to do wrestling, would that be advantageous to you? Yes, it's going to make you better at wrestling, it's going to make you better at grappling, it's going to increase your strength, your fitness, your ability to sustain, your mental toughness, your ability to sustain certain types of hurt and pain, and everything related to fitness, endurance, toughness, as Oz covers in his very good video. So yes, I agree with that, but here's the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is that grappling and wrestling aren't that important to lots of styles of HEMA. Let's take one example. Small sword, okay? The thing which is clearly closest to small sword fencing in the world is foil fencing, and you could say épée fencing as well. Okay, so fencing, essentially. Now, if you have 8 hours of training in your week, if you have 4 hours training in your week, you have a finite amount of training time. So if you want to be the best possible small sword fencer you can possibly be, then what you need is the most possible time small sword fencing. And I've made this anecdote times in the past, but I can remember my Kung Fu teacher basically telling herself for spending too much time in the gym lifting weights, not because lifting weights isn't beneficial, but because in some cases we were skipping Kung Fu classes to do it. And he said, if you want to get better at Kung Fu, do more Kung Fu. Now, when you do fencing, you are also getting a lot of the physical benefits that you get from wrestling. You're doing the physical condition, you're building up your stamina, your fitness, your flexibility, your ability to lunge and recover quickly, all of these things, and it's specific to that activity. So yes, while wrestling might be beneficial, and yes, occasionally you might be able to use it in a small sword duel or a small sword fencing match in a HEMA context, very occasionally, 99% of what actually happens in a fight between small swords is small sword fencing. So therefore, clearly the best thing to do with most of your time is small sword fencing. And I would say on that point, some of you might be thinking at this point, well, you should go and study foil fencing or épée fencing. We do! Lots of us have done. I studied foil at school, I did épée after university, and I did modern sabre at university. I did lots of sport fencing experience, and loads of other instructors in HEMA did as well. I can think of most clubs actually that have been around for 20 years, like mine, they had a basis in sport fencing. Not only that, a number of our current members and instructors also still do modern Olympic FIE fencing. So lots of practitioners involved in modern HEMA also compete and also train at sport fencing, and we have people come in from modern Olympic style fencing into HEMA and train with us, so they themselves are doing the two things and fencing with us. Is there a big chasm? Is there a big gap in skill and level? No. Certainly in my club anyway, it might be different in different clubs, but in my club, when we have a foil fencer or a sabre fencer from modern Olympic fencing coming along, my best fencers all hold their own, and in fact many cases beat them. And some of the fencers in my club can go to a modern Olympic fencing competition, they know the rules, they've learnt right of way, they've learnt how to play those rules and that kind of stuff, and they can beat a lot of fairly good modern Olympic style fencers at club level, certainly even regional level. So we have as good fencers in HEMA as they have in modern Olympic fencing, and the same would go incidentally for Kendo, Kenjutsu, Aikido, Filipino martial arts, all of the other weapon-based martial arts. So fundamentally, if you're training primarily to do fencing, then train primarily to do fencing. Not to say wrestling might not be advantageous to do as well if you have extra time and if you want to do it, but fundamentally 99% of fencing with something like small sword does come down to the use of the sword, and you're never going to be able to use your wrestling or grappling if the opponent is always stabbing you before you can ever get to grapple with them. And that's actually a really important point to make. I have known over my many years in HEMA a number of people who are extremely good grapplers with competition level skills in BJJ, judo, various other things, okay? And even competition level MMA, I've got some in my club at the moment as happens. And fundamentally, yes, those people are super dangerous if they get into a grapple with you. But if you're a better fencer than them, how are they going to get into grapple with you? They have to also be good at fencing. In order to use your grappling, your disarms, your closes, your wrestling, you have to also be good with the weapon. And if you're not good enough with the weapon against your opponent, you're never going to get to use your grappling because you're going to be shanked before you can ever do it. Now, to reel it back a bit, I picked a deliberately exaggerated example there of small sword fencing, and I would also say this largely goes for sabre fencing as well. So if we're looking at military sabre, small sword, and perhaps rapier and dagger as well, perhaps single rapier, I would argue that wrestling and grappling are of a little bit of use in terms of fitness, toughness, and the grappling skills, but they're not of very much use. Now, Oz picked a number of very good sources to demonstrate the point that grappling was highly revered by certain people in history. Two examples that he picked were Pietro Monte and Fiore di Liberi. I'm somewhat familiar with Fiore di Liberi as I've been teaching parts of his source for 20 years. However, I accept I'm not very good at the abrazare, I'm not very good at the grappling, but nevertheless I still teach it, I still do it, but I would never say I do it to a particularly high level. But that being said, my observation over many years of doing longsword, which I used to compete in back in the day, is that people can be very good at grappling, but again, if they're not good at the sword, then they don't get the chance, the ability, the opportunity to do the grappling stuff. But that aside, Oz picked those particular sources. And yes, in the medieval period with particular weapons, longsword, dagger, poleaxe, fighting in armour, these kinds of things, wrestling is definitely very important, especially in armour, because you've got to remember, of course, that wrestling in armour, or fighting in armour, a lot of it will come down to wrestling. No question, no debate there. However, how important is wrestling to unarmoured spear? A bit, maybe. How important is it to something like Bowie knife? A bit important. Not super important though. I would argue, how important is it to small sword and sabre? Not really important at all. How important is it to unarmoured longsword or unarmoured langmesser? There's an interesting question. If we look at the medieval and Renaissance sources, mostly 15th, 16th century, then indeed we do see lots of grappling with the longsword, lots of grappling with the messer, and indeed if we look into side sword and rapier, not so much side sword actually, interestingly, not very much grappling at all in Marozzo and Manciolino. In fact, very little, almost none, thinking about it. But anyway, that aside, if we come on to rapier, you see some grappling, occasional grappling in rapier, in a clinch, but most of, like 85–90% of what's in most rapier treatises is fencing. It's not grappling or wrestling. So, to conclude on that point, I would say that yes, wrestling is very important to some armed parts of HEMA, like fighting in armour in Fiore or Pietromonte, or fighting with poleaxes in armour, but it's far, far less important, and I would say almost unimportant to certain other types of weapon-based martial arts. So to conclude, I don't believe that HEMA is broken at all. It's growing really, really well and developing amazingly and doing much better than lots of other comparative martial arts out there. Do I think that it requires more wrestling? It really depends on what you're doing. I think if you're doing Fiore, yes, if I'm honest, I should be doing more grappling, should be doing more wrestling training. So I'm not trying to escape doing it myself. I am completely hands up saying, yes, I should probably do more grappling if I'm focusing on Fiore, which if I'm honest, I don't particularly focus on these days. These days, what do I actually mostly fence myself? I mostly fence sabre, small sword, a little bit of foil and epee to modern rules, that's a bit of fun recently, and also rapier and dagger, sword and buckler, things like this. Is wrestling and grappling particularly important to those? Not particularly, and I have to say the nature of the wrestling and grappling that's involved always involved shanking the person with the thing in the hand. So even though I might be grabbing them, I might be putting them into some kind of hold or whatever with one arm, I'm stabbing them with the other arm, and proportionately the stabbing them with the other arm is the most important part. But I don't want to completely undermine Oz's point, because he does have a very good point, I believe, in reference to some parts of HEMA, and I certainly think if your focus is on ringen or unarmed, wrestling basically, unarmed martial arts in HEMA, then yes, you should probably be training with perhaps more modern approaches, if you don't already. And that's the other thing I have to say. Much like fencing, I know lots of people who are doing modern HEMA with swords. They also do modern fencing with foil epee sabre, and have backgrounds in it, like me and various other instructors I can think of. But in addition, lots of the people doing HEMA grappling also do BJJ, MMA, judo, whatever. So many people do Aikido as well. I know Oz has controversial views on, maybe not so controversial views on that, but nevertheless, they do cross-train. And so I also want to get rid of that as a myth, that the idea that HEMA people aren't cross-training, because HEMA people do cross-train and have always cross-trained since the beginning, myself included. I have done kendo, I have done sport fencing, I have done reenactment fighting and all sorts of other things, and I have done Chinese and Japanese martial arts as well. I hope this has been thought-provoking. If you massively disagree with me and you agree with Oz, that's fine. We're talking about martial arts and history on this channel, and hopefully you enjoy that content, and hopefully you'll enjoy the content on Oz's channel as well. So go and check out his video and his other videos. He's been churning out the videos recently, and I hope I'll see you back on my channel as well really soon. Take care, folks. I have been Matt Easton, and I will continue to be.